individuals were noting that the officers were basically saying, move along or doing nothing. That's not a good answer for our city. It's not a good answer for all those neighborhoods in crisis. We need to be doing diversion and doing diversion right.
That's Councilmember Bob Kettle talking about the future of Seattle's drug possession and public drug use law this week, a future that might not look too much different from the past. Some changes underway to that law this week. We're going to talk about that. The future of the King County Regional Homelessness Authority, very top of mind this week, too, in the wake of a lawsuit filed against that embattled agency. And why are two city council members in Seattle proposing a big overhaul for Seattle's free meals program for kids in our public schools? We are covering these topics and more this week on Seattle News, Views, and Brews, your coffee break political podcast. I'm Brian Callanan. I'm a host on the Seattle channel. The views expressed here are mine. And I am with my friend and co-host David Croman, City Hall reporter for the Seattle Times. And David, it is all-star break time. I'm going to let the Mariners record speak for itself, under 500, yuck. But my question this week is, are the greatest/worst baseball fans in the world from Philadelphia? Because I saw this during the home run derby. They were booing the kids in the outfield who were catching balls that did not get hit out by Phillies contestants in the derby there. I was just thinking, these fans are next level. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I didn't get a chance to watch the home run derby, sadly. I heard that there was some booing involved.
Totally.
I didn't, bring a little heated rivalry into what is usually a kind of polite event, make it more fun. Whatever. And those kids are probably all like children of executives, and I feel like you have to pull some real strings to be down there. So they can handle a little booing.
I was waiting for that home run Karen to reappear in the outfield and take a ball away from a kid like she did last year. But that didn't happen, thankfully. David, thank you for joining me, as you always do. Thanks also to our background noise sponsor, City Grind Espresso on the first floor of City Hall. Say hi to my friend John when you visit there. Please support the show, folks. Become a patron on Patreon. Giving levels start at just $5 a month. You get access to Patrons First podcast. Just had one of those with Councilmember Eddie Lynn. You get a cool decal, too. Please head to Patreon. Become a paying member. A shout out to our friends at Converge Media. The video version of the program is on Converge on Wednesdays. We appreciate their support. Let's get this going. Time for Right Here, Right Now. Okay, so the Seattle City Council's Public Safety Committee is considering an update to its drug possession and public drug use law this week. Remember this? Back in 2023, there was a lot of controversy over this. It appeared that the council was cracking down on drug use, though the law did specify that diversion and treatment and other alternatives to booking were the preferred approach when enforcing those crimes. But then the data came out earlier this year. We reported on this on the podcast in April. Arrests up by 47%. Law enforcement assisted diversion, you'll hear it called LEAD sometimes, down 30%. So now, David, the city wants to further specify in its law that the preferred approach is pre-booking diversion to be done in the field by officers. Why do you think this change is needed? Can you break this down?
Yeah, I think part of it is that there's a lot of discretion given to officers right now. And I think what they're trying to do here is make it so that it is formal SPD policy that the preferred approach is some kind of diversion. I also think that the language around in the field, quote, warm handoffs is important because the implication there is if you just kind of give somebody a card and say, okay, here's LEAD, go and find them. And there's not any guarantee that those people actually seek out those services. And there's not really any follow-up here. And so this is saying the preferred approach is that not only are you going to diversion, but you are actually passing that person off to somebody who works for LEAD or an outreach
service provider.
Service provider. Another piece, too, is that there has to be some kind of data. They have to report a little more stringently on outcomes and what actually happens with those people afterwards. The diversion piece is written into the drug ordinance law, but I think there is some question, not to say that it's not effective, but not as much insight into exactly what is happening after that diversion as maybe City Hall would like. But I think the thought behind this is, by having this warm handoff piece, you are actually having somebody who's guaranteeing that they are making a connection to an outreach worker. And then with the data piece, the hope, I think, is you have maybe a little more follow-up and information on what actually came of it.
Yeah, I heard in that meeting, too, that the data coming from LEAD is fairly robust, and there have been some good situations there where people have gone through on the handoff and gotten the services they need. But there are other agencies, too, connected with it that might not have as robust a data system. Yeah. So that data part is super important. And I guess I was really struck by the fact, it was very interesting to me to hear the council's Public Safety Committee Chair, Bob Kettle, talk so much about how this drug law that went into effect 3 years ago is a failure. It's not working. And I guess I'm trying to look at that next step. Is this change going to help when it comes to drug enforcement in Seattle? Does Seattle have the dollars needed to support LEAD? Because that's a part of this too. What impact is this change going to have?
Yeah, again, I don't know. And, I think the biggest question for me is capacity,
Capacity for LEAD and these agencies.
For the outreach, for the diversion agencies, just because, that was already a question. And I think that, at least that seemed to be the kind of most official explanation for that increase arrests and drop in diversion was just that perhaps the capacity wasn't there or the funding wasn't there. It disappeared briefly. And so, when you're talking about, again, you have to have this kind of direct handoff. I'm curious to know how quick and nimble the outreach and diversion agencies can be with all of those. At the end of the day, it's City Hall and Councilmember Kettle trying to be a little bit more explicit about how this is supposed to work and have City Hall have a little more say in exactly what protocols SPD officers are supposed to follow. It's one thing to put it on paper, but again, whether or not there are the resources and capacity to follow through on that, I don't know.
And whether or not SPD officers do it too. I heard in the meeting too, Councilmember Juarez saying, well, we'll see what the union says about this, how this changes their job description or whatever else, which is always something that is negotiated there. That could be a factor in this too, I think.
Yeah, and I think in one of the earlier presentations, Chief Barnes and some other folks talked about the kind of checklists that officers are supposed to go through when they are making a drug-related arrest or at least having an interaction that's related to drugs is so lengthy and it's at once kind of cumbersome for them to go through it and also kind of subjective enough that you could make any case fit into it or not.
Sure.
I think officers are sort of taking advantage of that. So again, I think the thought is by weaving this a little more explicitly into SPD policy, you make it so it is perhaps a little more objective or a little more kind of procedural in how they go about it. As with all things city government, it will take some time to kind of see whether the intentions and the effects of the law are the same.
Yeah, there's what the legislative branch is doing, and there's how it's executed and enforced out in the field. So definitely a lot ahead with this. Interested to see what happens next there. I did want to talk about what's been happening with the KCRHA right now, the King County Regional Homelessness Authority. We talked about this last week, this plan to change KCRHA's role to stick with handling state and federal funding, the city and county really taking back more of the on-the-street work. Now we're getting more details on a lawsuit filed by a Belltown resident, Sung Kwan, who was driving when a gunman shot into the passenger compartment of his car, killing his pregnant wife and unborn daughter. This was 3 years ago. KCRHA was providing case management and housing to this gunman. Kwan calls those efforts a systemic failure, as reported in the Seattle Times. He's filing a civil suit for unspecified monetary damages. He was actually exonerated in a criminal suit when they found that he was not guilty by reason of insanity. David, I know we're not legal experts. What do you make of this civil case?
First, that is horrible.
What happened?
Nothing good about this. I feel very terribly for him. This, to me, is a story about involuntary treatment and designated crisis responders. I think they are really relevant here because, we should say that there was some indication that the shooter here had expressed concern about what he might do. And I think that's kind of the crux of their argument, is that he had basically made clear that he might hurt somebody and that not enough was done.
Yeah, this happened in 2023. He was actually reporting some hallucinations, some paranoia and suicidal and homicidal ideation. This is according to the lawsuit. And this is right after he enrolled in the Homelessness Authority's program. Anyway, it was right after his sister died, this gunman here, and he went to the psychiatric unit at Harborview and talked about this. Keep going.
Which is, so the argument they're making is that KCRHA should have done something about that. And you can understand why they're making that argument. And, whenever an agency is in charge of the well-being of its clients, there's some liability there, of course. The reason I bring up involuntary treatment and designated crisis responders is because, the bar in Washington for what you do with an individual like that, because you can't arrest somebody for saying for being unstable alone. Right. The mechanism for that is involuntary treatment, which is somebody has concluded that you are a harm to yourself or others or gravely disabled, and therefore that you should not be free to walk around anymore, that basically you should be detained, except instead of in jail, you're detained in a hospital.
Yep.
The people who can give that authorization, though, are pretty limited. It's basically just cops and designated crisis responders.
Yeah.
And the fundamental flaw in the system right now is that involuntary treatment is predicated on a short-term and temporary state of mind, which is not generally, are you a threat? It's in this moment, right now, are you a threat to yourself or others? But the lag time to get a designated crisis responder or a cop out there is such that oftentimes by the time they're actually able to get out there, either the situation has passed or in this case, something horrible has happened. It sounds like a day before the shooting happened, they had contacted a designated crisis responder to come and evaluate this person. And they said, as is quite common these days, we can't get out there today. We're so backlogged.
Yeah.
And that is just essentially a broken system because you have the whole thing really only works as if you can get immediate and in the moment evaluations of people.
Yeah.
And that didn't happen here. And frankly, that's occurring frequently in our current system that people are waiting hours or days to get that evaluation. It just so happens that in this case, the worst possible case scenario did end up happening. It turns out this person was, in fact, a grave danger to himself and particularly others, but nobody was able to get out there in time to do anything about it. So, I don't know what the liability of KCRHA is here. That feels a little above my pay grade. But I do think it is quite indicative of an essential failing in how we handle people who are determined to be either a grave danger to themselves or others and how involuntary treatment works.
Right. It's really putting this one county agency on the hook for what is a much larger issue here. I was going to ask what impact this could have on the KCRHA, which is dealing with so many financial issues right now and just systemic issues right there. I guess this is just one of the different problems that they're rolling with right now. How do you look at this impacting the KCRHA going forward?
I don't know. There's so much in flux with the KCRHA.
Yeah, it feels like
I don't know that this would have any, because it's a civil case. If I had to guess, there would end up being a settlement on this, because it certainly doesn't look like a slam dunk for KCRHA to win if they were to go to trial, and they probably want to avoid something like that. So that would be my guess, mostly just because that's what usually ends up happening as a settlement here. Part of the scrutiny of KCRHA is it has been sloppy in its administration and oversight and stewardship of fiscal resources. And here you have, at least as the evidence shows, an example of some kind of more fundamental oversight of the people that it was in charge with. And, certainly not good. I wouldn't think that it helps KCRHA's case, but I couldn't say anything about what it means sort of long term for the agency.
Again, such a large issue that we're talking about here, and putting KCRHA on the hook for it's going to be an interesting case going forward. But I could really see that turning into a settlement with the city and county too going forward. All right, well, up next, some potential changes to the school meal program that provides help and food to students and their families across Seattle. Why are two council members in Seattle pushing for an overhaul of this successful program? More next on Now Hear This. Well, a proposal emerged from the Families, Education, Preschool, and Promise Levy Committee meeting last week. That levy, which the city uses to support public school kids in Seattle, is up for renewal later this year. Councilmember Dion Foster, Council President Joy Hollingsworth want to make some changes to the meals that the city helps provide as part of the FEP levy, as it's called. Their proposal would eliminate funding for free school breakfasts and lunches for at least the first year of the levy, and those funds would go towards a new program, vouchers for low-income kids to get meals during holiday breaks during the school year and on weekends. Public commenters at the meeting overwhelmingly did not like this idea.
Universal school meals reach every student automatically with no application or extra steps for families, and a voucher model would require families to apply, qualify, and redeem benefits through a limited number of participating vendors, creating additional barriers for the very families we're trying to support.
David, I want to try to explain some of the ideas behind this. I think both council members are considering that the statewide millionaire's tax will pay for universal school meals after the 2027-2028 school year, so they're banking on that a little bit. And it appears the council members are kind of approaching this, well, they really are approaching this from a racial justice perspective. Feeding the poorest kids should take priority over providing meals to all kids, like the ones who wouldn't necessarily qualify for free meals in the current program. What do you make of what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's easy to have a headline that says, council members oppose free lunches for students.
Right.
More nuance than that to your point, yeah, I think they're figuring if some money is coming down the pike from the state, why are we dedicating long-term resources to doing something that might already be done? That's the kind of technical piece. But, I do think there's kind of a more philosophical conversation here that we hear quite a bit, particularly among kind of left-wing progressive communities around how benefits should be distributed, whether they should be, I think this is sort of a derogatory term for it, but means tested. Basically, you have to prove that you need it and qualify for it versus kind of a universal benefit. The argument for a universal benefit is it reduces stigma around enrollment. And, it's a lot to do for people to prove that they qualify for something. And we know,
filling out paperwork and stuff like that. Yeah,
exactly. Yeah. I mean, just look at the changes to the federal government to Medicare requirements. They're basically asking for more paperwork and they expect that to lead to millions and millions of people no longer being on Medicare. So we know that adding process and paperwork to something makes it more difficult to access. I'm sure there are ways around that. But that is the argument in favor of universal enrollment is you probably get more people taking advantage of it than otherwise would. You reduce the stigma. Of course, the other argument against that is that means rich kids are getting free lunches.
Right.
And in a world of limited resources, perhaps, and I don't think that would necessarily be the case here, but perhaps those rich kids are getting lunches at the expense of some poorer kids who might benefit more from them. And I think that's the argument that council members Hollingsworth and Foster. So, I don't know that there's a correct answer here exactly. And it is something, I feel like around 2020 and 2021, when there was a lot of, conversation around racial justice and racial equity, this debate came up quite a bit, whether it's better to do benefits on a means tested benefit versus universal. I don't know that we have like a great answer to that, but that is where both of these sides are coming from here.
One last touch on this whole idea about banking on the millionaire's tax, which I gotta say is by no means settled. We're going to have a measure later on this fall where people are going to vote on this, and if it goes away, there's going to be some Supreme Court action on this too, I have to imagine. Some thoughts about that, about banking on what feels like, to me at least, a pretty volatile revenue source.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, it does feel like there is an assumption that it will stick around. And honestly, when you look at polling and the makeup of the current Washington Supreme Court, it's not a terrible assumption. The polling is looking pretty good that the millionaire's tax will not go away. And the Washington Supreme Court, I would say, appears kind of ready to strike down this precedent. So I don't think it's a totally unreasonable thing to assume that is going to come. At the same time, it's certainly not guaranteed. Either one of those things could derail it. And so, I mean, it's a good point. I mean, I guess you could just argue that, whatever happens there, if it does get struck down, they could go back and reroute some of the dollars. But it is harder to reroute dollars that have already been allocated to than it is to budget them up front. So if they do kind of spread these dollars around and then realize, we want to take some more for free lunches, it's then you got to ask who are you going to cut? Who are you going to take the dollars from? So I think you can see an argument for why they would assume this money is coming. And also, I think long term, it will be easier for them to decide on what they want to do right now.
Both things can be true. That's for sure. I wanted to follow up on a story that we touched on here on the podcast. The security cameras turned on around the stadium district for the World Cup have now been turned off, as the mayor's office reports. And then a few days later, Councilmember Bob Kettle pushed back. He wants those cameras to stay on. David, I want to put the Kettle versus Wilson battle on hold for just a minute here. Is the mayor going to keep these cameras off? Has the case been made that these cameras should stay on? Some thoughts about this.
I think in her view, she's kind of doing what she said she was going to do back in, I can't remember, maybe it was February when she had that press conference.
And talked about it a ton on the campaign trail, too.
She talked about it a lot on the campaign trail. And then when she came into office, kind of came up with this plan, which you could maybe argue didn't really leave anybody fully happy, but which was, we're going to study this more. And depending on, basically, if NYU, who we've commissioned to look into the safety of these cameras, comes back and tells me they're fine, then I'll turn them on. If they come back and say there's some significant concerns here, I won't. So in her view, the turning them on during the World Cup was a temporary measure, and it was always going to be temporary. She feels like she kind of advertised, I will only turn them on in an event of a critical threat to the World Cup. We had that. I turned them on. That threat has passed. I'm turning them off. It is actually sort of follows the logic she laid out. I just think for the for the people who are following this issue closely, it still has a little bit of a feel of whiplash. And so, I think at this point it seems clear they're probably going to stay off for the next 4 or 5 months or however long it takes for NYU to get back.
Yeah.
And then she will have to make a permanent decision. She
Right.
kind of forecasted in that initial press conference, frankly, that I think she expects that the report is going to say they're okay and that the
Yeah.
protections are strong enough. I don't remember exactly the words she used. I don't have them right in front of me, but it was pretty clear that she was kind of priming the people who want them to turn off for disappointment in some ways, that
Ah,
if NYU comes back and says no problem, she probably is going to turn them on. So that'll be an interesting conversation, but I would imagine it gets kicked until at least the fall.
yeah. I like good data-based governance. That sounds good to me. That's definitely something at work here. I remember talking with her, too, a couple months ago, though, as well, about this issue. And it's like, well, you know what? There's actually a lot of other cameras down there already beyond this CCTV setup that the city has. So there's...
Well, I mean, that's the whole thing about this is
Yeah.
the surveillance question has eaten up a lot of oxygen. And,
Yeah.
and I think there are people who care a lot about it on either end.
Sure.
I think there are also a lot of people in the middle who think exactly what you think. Who's like, I don't really care that much one way or the other because I assume I'm on camera all the time anyway.
Yeah.
And so whether or not these extra 30 cameras are there, I don't know.
Sure.
It's going to be the end all be all of public safety in Seattle. But
Yeah.
I think, it goes to this question of who she was on the campaign trail versus
Yeah.
who she is as mayor. And it is a wedge in City Hall. And so therefore it eats up a lot of oxygen, even if haven't seen polling on it. But my guess would be that for a large majority of the city, I don't think this is the number one most important issue.
Yeah. Briefly, I wanted to touch on the Kettle versus Wilson dispute here because he's pushing back on this issue. He pushed back on the cost of her transit measure very recently, put out press releases on both of those, very public about his disagreements with the mayor. I know there's been some factious times between the mayor and the council here. What do you make of this back and forth in particular?
Yeah, Kettle, we know that there is some tension between the mayor and the council. A lot of that is very Seattle tension in that we hear about it in sort of grumblings, but in public, they're all very polite. The exception to that is Kettle. He seems to be the one council member who is being pretty open and candid about his frustrations with how the mayor's office is operating, particularly around public safety.
Yeah.
But, with KCRHA and stuff too. So he,
making it a regional thing. Yeah, right.
He feels like he's not getting the kind of communication and process from the mayor's office that he wants to see. And for an ex-Navy intelligence guy,
no, you don't do that. Right.
Communication and process is very important.
Yeah.
And so, I don't know what his long-term political ambitions are. I guess I could ask him. I would say he has elevated himself as kind of the number one foil to Mayor Katie Wilson on the council, or at least the most vocal.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, well, coming up, let's talk about that transit measure that Councilmember Kettle was upset about because there was a very big public hearing about it earlier this week. Are taxpayers tired? Do they not want to double their sales taxes for this measure? Find out more on What's Next. David, we talked about all these amendments connected to the mayor's transit measure proposal last week. She wants to double the size of it, raising it from 0.15% to 0.3%, make it a 10-year proposal and generate $138 million a year over the next decade, would cost people about $29 a year, and it would expand King County Metro's Seattle service by roughly 95,000 hours a year. Councilmember Kettle put out this counter-proposal to lower the cost to 0.2, saying he could still accomplish many of the mayor's goals. And then we had this public hearing on Monday. Turns out people apparently love paying taxes, David. I heard overwhelmingly that people want the full 0.3%. They want more service, not less. What do you make of those public comments?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because it feels like this, and you could probably argue the library levy too, are kind of the tips of a larger iceberg and therefore are getting a lot of attention about how they fit into the general tax and affordability environment. And so there is a lot of debate around whether the size of both of those is appropriate. I call them an iceberg because preceding them have been much larger and more significant and more expensive measures around housing and transportation and sound transit, frankly, so.
Yeah, I would have accepted the straw that breaks the camel's back metaphor. Please keep going.
Yeah, exactly. It is important to point out, when we're talking about this transit measure, we're talking like, I think the whole thing, not counting the increase, but the whole thing would cost like $58 a year for most people, which in the context of how much most people are paying in property taxes and the rent that is then, and how that's factored into rent,
Yeah.
$58 is not a lot. And so the difference between whether this is a 0.3% increase or a 0.2% increase,
Yeah.
I think is going to be like $29 or $30 a person. So it is interesting. And so I think people's kind of public comment demand to keep it as is more reflective of the fact that when in a vacuum, this measure is not actually that large. I think the conversation that Kettle and others on the council are having is a larger one around kind of creep, which is every one of these that we grow eventually all adds up. City Hall was basically okay with that for many years, and you can argue maybe they still are okay with that, but it just I think the pressure has mounted a little bit so that every time there's a new proposal like this, even if it's relatively small, like the transit measure one, it's going to get more scrutiny than frankly even some of the much larger levies for housing and transportation or education got.
Yeah, but it appears to me that the council is not going to make many substantive changes to what the mayor proposed in terms of cost. Would you say so?
Yeah, I think that's my read. Again, I mean, also, what did the last transit measure pass with? Like it's like 80% of the vote or something.
4 out of 5 people said yes.
This is not a fight that most Seattle voters are asking for. And in fact, I would say most Seattle voters probably see themselves as being very pro-transit, even if they don't necessarily ride transit as much as they would like to. So again, I think there is a quite legitimate conversation to have around how city government is funding basic services. And library and levy lid lifts and the state of our tax system more generally. But if you just kind of zero in on what this proposal is and its popularity, it's not particularly large and is going to pass with huge majorities, almost certainly.
Yeah, definitely. All right, well, it's time to wrap up. David, you have some big news this week. You're leaving the Seattle Times, starting a new gig at KUOW. Can you tell people about it?
Yeah, so, bittersweet, I'm leaving my job at the Seattle Times. I'm not going to be on the City Hall beat there anymore, and I'm joining Soundside on KUOW with Libby Dankman, where I'm going to be on your airwaves 4 days a week from 12 to 1.
What are you going to be covering? What kind of stuff?
I mean, it's the local news show of KUOW. So, all things considered, so to speak. We will, be talking politics. We'll be talking art. We'll be talking science. If you listen to Libby and Soundside now, I imagine a lot of that is going to stay. But, we're also going to take the show off the air for a few weeks so we can reimagine what it's going to be like with two hosts.
Yeah.
I think part of it is there's going to be a little more back and forth between me and Libby, kind of give the show hopefully a little more dynamic and live feel to it, I think is the thought. But, that's TBD. I'm excited for it. I'm sad to leave my gig at the Seattle Times, but excited to try something new.
That's awesome. Well, David and I, folks, will be rocking it through the end of July. What happens next for the podcast? David's going to be moving on, but I'm working on it. I would love to hear from all of our patrons out there with some ideas. I will be back in touch. But, David, we'll keep talking about this. Thank you so much for being a part of this show.
Thanks so much for having me over the years. It's been a true honor.
Always, always. And meanwhile, thanks to everybody listening to Seattle News, Views, and Brews, where you can always find out what's happening and what's brewing in local politics. Become a patron to access Patrons First podcast, like the one I hosted last week. Please check out Seattle News, Views, and Brews on Patreon. Pledge $5 a month or more. Thanks for the help. Great to have you listening to this podcast on Apple, Overcast, Spotify, wherever you tune in. Thanks for watching on Converge Media, too. See you next time. Seattle News, Views, and Brews is an independent production of Callanan Media Services. Copyright 2026.